Diana Frances Spencer came into the world on July 1st, 1961. We share the same birthday. And she was born not into a hospital, but in a house on royal land. And that is Park House, Sandringham, leased from the Queen herself. The Spencers had been intertwined with the crown for generations, 5 centuries of aristocracy. And descended from King Charles II, her father served as equerry to 2 monarchs. And young Diana would call Queen Elizabeth Aunt Lilibet. And she was born into privilege, but she was not born into happiness necessarily, because her parents had desperately wanted a boy. And a year earlier, they'd actually lost a son named John, who was just 10 hours old. So when Diana arrived, they were not as happy. They really wanted a boy, and they would wait an entire week to even name her, which is just so sad. And that rejection was only the beginning. And when Diana was 6 years old, her mother would fall in love with another man and leave. And what followed was a custody battle so vicious that Diana's own grandmother testified against her daughter in court, and the children stayed with their father. So her mother, kind of a piece of shit. And Diana would later tell her nanny that she used to wait on the doorstep for her mother, but she never came home. Just heartbreaking. And that abandonment carved something deep into her. And at just 9 years old, she made a vow saying, quote, "I will never marry unless I'm really in love. Because if you're not in love, you're going to get divorced. And I never intend to be divorced." You and me both, Diana. It's probably around that time when my dad was on his second marriage. And I was like, I don't think you're doing this right. And then he got divorced later on. Shout out, Dad. 2 divorces in. Maybe 3 come. We'll see. I don't know. I'm just kidding, Dad. Just kidding. But also, it's true. Anyway, but she would carry that wound everywhere through boarding school, where she failed her exams twice, but won an award for helping others, and through a miserable stint at finishing school in Switzerland, and through her short-lived dream of becoming a ballerina because she grew too tall. But eventually she would move to London. And at 18, Diana moved into a flat her mother bought her in Earl's Court, valued at around £50,000. Okay, mommy came back. mommy bought a really expensive flat for her, but that doesn't buy back love, okay? And regardless, from coming from
Can't
a
buy
very
me
wealthy
love.
family, she would work 3 days a week as a kindergarten assistant. And the other days, she was a nanny for an American family who only discovered she was an aristocrat when they found a bank slip from Coots, the royal family's bank, marked Lady Diana Spencer. You know, it just goes to show she was very humble from the very beginning. And she just genuinely loved helping people. And she was shy, and she was kind, and she was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. And she would later call these years the happiest of her life. But she had no idea what was coming. So the first time Diana Spencer met Prince Charles, she was 16 years old, and he was 29 and dating her older sister, actually, at the time. So it was November 1997 at a shooting party at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, and Charles was there for Sarah. And Diana was just the kid's sister, home from boarding school, lingering in the plowed fields in her welts. But Charles would notice her, and he would later describe her as a very jolly and amusing and attractive 16-year-old. Kind of gross knowing that he's 29 years old, but we're just gonna skip past that, I guess. And Diana would notice him too. And she already had photos of the prince by her bedside. Him just being a schoolgirl crush she'd never expected to amount to anything. But her private first impression was telling. With, quote, "God, what a sad man," she would say about the first encounter later on in life with him. So 3 years would go by, and the relationship with Sarah, Diana's older sister, would fizzle. And Charles drifted through a string of eligible women while the palace grew impatient. And at this point, he was 31 and the heir to the throne, and also unmarried, which ain't good in the royal family. And then came the summer of 1980, and Charles was reeling from the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, his great uncle, and his mentor, the man he called his honorary grandfather. And he was killed by an IRA bomb the year before. And at a barbecue that July, Diana found him sitting alone. And she went to him saying, quote, "You looked so sad when you walked up the aisle at the funeral," unquote, she said. Quote, "You need someone beside you," unquote. And according to Diana, that's when everything changed. Quote, whereupon he leapt upon me and started kissing me, unquote. And what followed was one of the shortest courtships in royal history. And Diana would later reveal the truth to biographer Andrew Morton, saying, quote, we met 13 times and we got married, unquote. 13 times. Which I know there's other marriages that happen around the world, like arranged marriages. They never meet at all, but for this, specifically for the royal family, it's kind of crazy. But she was a beautiful young woman plucked from obscurity to marry the most eligible bachelor in the world. But behind closed doors, there were warning signs from the very beginning. The engagement was announced on February 24th, 1981, and Diana was 19. And the press gathered for the obligatory interview. The smiling couple, sparkling rings, softball questions, and then a reporter asked, and I suppose in love? And Diana answered immediately, saying, oh. And Charles paused. This is where all the red flags start sticking up in the air, lit on fire. And he says, oh my God. And Diana's face would flicker. And she would later describe that moment as traumatic, saying, quote, I thought, what a strange answer, unquote. But Diana's ring was a 12-carat Salon sapphire surrounded by 14 diamonds. And Diana had chosen it herself from a Garrard catalog. And it wasn't custom-made or one-of-a-kind by any means, but it was beautiful. But some in the palace considered it unsuitably common. Oh, I dare think it's unsuitably common diamond. Whatever, dude. Anytime Diana could have got dunked on by the family, she got dunked on, okay? But that same ring now sits on the finger of Catherine, Princess of Wales. But even before the wedding, Diana discovered she wasn't the only woman in Charles' life. And about 2 weeks before the ceremony, she found a bracelet, gold, engraved with 2 letters, G and F. And she knew what that meant. Gladys and Fred, the pet names Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles had given each other, borrowed from a radio comedy called The Goon Show. And Diana, like any of us hearing this story, was absolutely devastated. And she confronted Charles, and she would overhear a phone call where he told Camilla, quote unquote, whatever happens, I will always love you. And she wanted to call off the wedding. But her sister's response was, quote, bad luck, Duck. Your face is on the tea towels now. You're too late to check it out, unquote. Some sisters, dude, it's all about imagery. It's all about image. And to rub dirt in the wound, the night before the wedding, Charles reportedly cried. Oh, come on. Piece of shit. So on July 29th, 1981, nearly 750 million people tuned in to watch Diana Spencer walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Allegedly,
Alright, these are shoulder straps, shoulder ruffles, shoulder stuff. The bottom half of the apron is almost done. We've got an odd piece here. Odd piece there that didn't sew right, so I had to take it apart. I need the bodice of the apron.
Pearls and sequins, 153 yards of tulle, and a train that stretched 25 feet behind her, the longest in royal wedding history. And that dress takes the cake. Best dress in history, in my opinion. But it was so voluminous that Diana could barely fit into the carriage. And she was very nervous, obviously. And she accidentally transposed Charles' name in her vows, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip. And the congregation chuckled warmly, but Diana did something else that day, something deliberate. And she became the first royal bride in history to omit the word obey from her vows. We love Diana for this. We absolutely love Diana for this. She's a queen. She's a queen. She's a princess, but she's a queen. And on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, they kissed, and the crowd roared. A new tradition was born, and then they left. So the cracks appeared almost immediately. I mean, even before, when he was crying to Camilla on the phone, the cracks were there before the wedding even happened, especially on the honeymoon. Because aboard the royal yacht Britannia, cruising the Mediterranean, Diana expected intimacy, connection, you know, as you do on your honeymoon, a chance to finally begin their life together. But instead, she found distance. And a few days into the voyage, photographs of Camilla fell from Charles' diary, and he was wearing gold cufflinks engraved with intertwined C's, a gift from Camilla. And he wanted to paint watercolors and read philosophy, and Diana wanted to talk. But they had nothing to say to each other. Diana reportedly destroyed one of his paintings during a blazing argument. And she, at this time, was 19 years old, alone on a boat with a man she barely knew, surrounded by staff, but also surrounded by silence. So the fairy tale was basically immediately over. Didn't even start, really. And she just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. But at some point, they were naturally intimate, and less than a year after the wedding, Diana was pregnant. And on June 21st, 1982, she gave birth to Prince William Arthur Philip Louis at St. Mary's Hospital in London. So it was a break from centuries of tradition, and the first direct heir to the throne ever born in a hospital rather than a palace. And it would not be her last break from tradition, which is why we love her. And when William was just 9 months old, Diana insisted on bringing him along on the royal tour of Australia and New Zealand. But no royal baby had ever accompanied their parents on an overseas visit. So, naturally, the palace resisted, but Diana refused to budge, and she won. And something remarkable happened on that trip, because the crowds didn't want Charles, they wanted her. They wanted Diana. And thousands of people lined the streets, craning for a glimpse of the young princess with the shy smile and the downcast eyes. And when Charles worked one side of the street and Diana the other, the side that got Charles audibly groaned with disappointment, which is awesome. But quote-unquote, Diana mania had begun. And she was 21 years old at this time, and she was already the most famous woman in the world. So 2 years later, on September 15th, 1984, Prince Harry was born. And Diana had hoped a second child might bring her closer to Charles, but instead, it drove them further apart. And Charles had wanted a girl, so when Harry arrived, red-haired and Spencer through and through, his reported reaction cut Diana deeply, saying, quote-unquote, "Oh God, it's a boy, and he's even got red hair." Shut the fuck up, you piece of shit. Diana would later say that moment was, quote, the beginning of the end, unquote, of their marriage. But if her marriage was failing, her motherhood was absolutely not, because Diana didn't raise her children the way royals were supposed to. She refused to wear hats to public events. You can't cuddle a child in a hat, she explained. And she took William and Harry to McDonald's, to Disney World, to homeless shelters and AIDS clinics. And she let them wear jeans and baseball caps. And she raced them to the car on the school run. And she sent William to a normal school, the first heir to the throne in history not educated privately at home. And when the palace suggested the boys be named Albert and Arthur, Diana overruled them, saying, "Too old," she said. Just literally a queen. She's the queen of standing on business. You do not with Mommy Diana, okay? Because she wanted her sons to understand the world beyond palace walls, and she wanted them to know that not everyone lived the way they did. Quote, "I want them to have an understanding of people's emotions, people's insecurities, people's distress, and people's hopes and dreams," unquote.
Today's video is sponsored by Autopia, a cozy life simulation game designed with creativity and freedom in mind. In this game, you can build your dream home, explore a wide variety of hobbies, and forge deep connections.
She was preparing them for something, and perhaps she didn't yet know what. So while Diana was redefining royal motherhood, her public image was reaching extraordinary heights, and the shy die of early engagements had evolved into something else entirely.
Alright, almost all the pieces for the apron are cut. I just need the waistband.
The most photographed person on the planet. And she collaborated with designers like Catherine Walker and Versace. Every event made headlines, and every hairstyle was copied. But the fascination went beyond fashion. There was something about Diana, just a warmth, a vulnerability, an openness that felt different from
You can tell I have a dog.
She made eye contact. just adored her for that.
Hi, pink little fairy.
Didn't know what to do with her.
Oh, and Metal Family. Sorry, I missed you earlier.
By 1986, the marriage
I try not to talk over Chris too
Charles would
much.
later admit it had irretrievably broken down by that year. And the cause wasn't mysterious. It had a name, and that name was Camilla Parker Bowles. Because Charles had never stopped loving her, even having 2 beautiful children with Diana and just going through the motions. He never really truly loved Diana. He was always in love with Camilla, even during their honeymoon. And now,
What's
with Diana
going on here?
consumed by motherhood and public duties,
Here.
he returned to Camilla
That's-
fully. And Diana knew. Of course, she knew. And in 1989, at a party, she confronted Camilla directly, and the details of that conversation have never been fully disclosed. But Diana would later summarize the state of her marriage with devastating clarity, saying, quote,
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
God, that interview was so iconic, and I'm so proud of her for that. But what the public didn't see, and what almost no one saw, was what was happening behind closed doors. Because Diana's bulimia began the week after she got engaged. Because Charles, again, stupidly, made a comment about her waist being a bit chubby, and it triggered something. And between her engagement and her wedding, Diana's waist shrank from 29 inches to 23 and a half inches. So she was disappearing, and no one in the palace seemed to notice, or I think just cared. She would say, quote, I was crying, but giving the wrong signals. But she binged, and she purged, and she hurt herself, and she cut her wrists and her chest, and she would even throw herself down a staircase while 4 months pregnant with William, saying, quote, I just needed time to adjust to my new position, unquote. But time wasn't something anyone gave her, and the institution was supposed to support her and had no idea how to handle a young woman in a crisis, so they just ignored it, or they blamed her, and the whispers inside the palace painted her as unstable and difficult and hysterical. So Diana was just drowning, and she was completely alone. So by the early 1990s, the war between Charles and Diana had spilled into public view, and both camps fed stories to sympathetic journalists, and both sides fought for control of the narrative, and the tabloids gorged on every leak, every rumor, and every sideways glance. The tapes came, and in August 1992, The Sun published transcripts of an intimate phone conversation between Diana and a man named James Kilby, and he called her Squidgy 53 times. So the press dubbed it Squidgygate. And Diana naturally was humiliated, but she didn't have to wait long for Charles' turn. And shortly after, transcripts emerged of a phone call between Charles and Camilla, which was
There we go. Finally got it to let go. I just need part of this thing. It's a duvet cover that I thrifted.
Camillagate made Squidgygate look extremely tame. So I'm not saying, Diana's innocent in all this necessarily. There was claims of that too. But from the get-go, this guy and the whole family was just like a piece of shit. So she needed someone to talk to. So I am taking sides. But at this time, the monarchy was eating itself alive. And then came the book. And in June of 1992, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. And it was a bombshell, detailing her bulimia, her isolation, her husband's affair, her...
I will definitely need to iron this.
And the palace was blindsided, and the public...
I'll get it ironed after I detach it from this big piece.
...was that Diana herself was the source, because she had secretly recorded hours of tapes and passed them to Morton through an intermediary. And the book was her testimony delivered while she was still trapped inside the institution. And it was, in many ways, the first shot in her war for independence. And there was one more secret Diana revealed, though this one would come later in her own voice. And his name was James Hewitt, a cavalry officer. Handsome, attentive, everything
What's
Charles
under there?
was not, basically. And their affair lasted
Hot glue.
5 years, from 1986 to 1991. Diana would eventually admit to it publicly in her 1995 Panorama interview saying, yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him. But I was very let down. And Hewitt sold his story for £300,000. And Diana learned once again that trust was a luxury she could not afford. And by the end of 1992, the marriage was over in all but name. And on December 9th, Prime Minister John Major stood in the House of Commons and read a statement from Buckingham Palace, saying, quote, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate, unquote. So the fairy tale was officially dead, although I think it was dead before it even started. But Diana's story was far from over. In fact, the most important chapter was just beginning. So while her marriage was crumbling, Diana found something that gave her life meaning, because she had always been expected to do charity work, and it came with the title, shake hands, cut ribbons, smile for the cameras, and move on. But Diana didn't do charity the way royals were supposed to, because she refused to wear gloves. And it sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Because for generations, members of the royal family had kept a barrier between themselves and the public, which was literal and symbolic, specifically white gloves with formal distance and a nod instead of a touch. But Diana stripped all that away because she wanted to feel the hands she held, and she wanted people to feel hers, saying, quote, I led from the heart, not the head.
Yes, I'm doing this at a weird angle. It's because my camera is in the way and I don't want to bump the live stream.
Let's forge the future together.
Oh, come on, Ad. Come on.
Unquote.
There we go.
And it would get her into more than trouble. It would change the world. Because on April 9th, 1987, London Middlesex Hospital, Britain's first dedicated AIDS unit, was opening, and Princess Diana was there to cut the ribbon. And at the time, the disease was barely understood and widely feared, and probably around half of the British public believed that AIDS patients should be quarantined, because people thought you could catch it from a handshake, from a toilet seat, from just breathing the same air. So the stigma was suffocating, and patients were dying alone and untouched and abandoned by their own families. But Diana walked into that ward and did something no one expected. She shook a patient's hand. No gloves, no hesitation, and she didn't let go. And it was 6 weeks before Ronald Reagan would even say the word AIDS in public. So it was one photograph and one gesture, and suddenly the most famous woman in the world was telling everyone watching, these people are not dangerous, they are not untouchable, they're human beings. And Diana would return to AIDS wards again and again over the following decade. And she held patients, and she hugged them, and she sat on their beds and listened to their stories. Quote, HIV does not make people dangerous to know, unquote, she declared at a 1991 conference. Quote, you can shake their hand and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it, unquote. One patient recalled the impact of her visit, saying, quote, the princess shook my hand without wearing a glove, and that meant more to me than anything, unquote. And Andrew Morton would later write that Diana had, quote, done more than anyone alive to remove the stigma surrounding the deadly AIDS virus, unquote. And she didn't do it with policy. She didn't do it with speeches. She did it with her hands. But Diana wasn't content to challenge stigma from the safety of hospital wards. And in January of 1997, she traveled to Angola, a country ravaged by decades of civil war and littered with landmines. Millions of them buried in fields and roads and schoolyards, and every month hundreds of civilians were killed or maimed, and many of them children. And the images from that trip became iconic, because Diana, dressed in body armor and a protective visor, walking slowly through an active minefield in Colombo. And one wrong step could have killed her, but she didn't flinch. And at one point, she detonated a practice mine, and the explosion echoed across the field. And Diana reportedly turned to her companions and said, one down, 17 million to go. I can't, she's just literally, I don't know how many times I can say she's a queen, but what the hell? She's a saint. I mean, nobody's perfect. Obviously, she's not perfect. Nobody's perfect, but my goodness, she's a good person. We can all say that. But the British government at this point was furious, and a junior minister called her a loose cannon. And politicians accused her of meddling in foreign policy, of being naive, of not understanding the complexities of international arms agreements. But Diana didn't give a shit. And she said, if I
I'm not a political figure. I am a humanitarian figure. I'm always happy and always will be.
And she returned to the cause again and again. And in August of 1997, just 23 days before her death, she visited Bosnia, walking through the ruins of a war-torn Sarajevo, meeting survivors and holding their hands. And at a speech in June of that year, she called landmines, quote-unquote, the plague on Earth. And 3 months after she died, 122 countries signed the Ottawa Treaty, banning anti-personnel landmines forever. So Diana didn't live to see it, but she did make it happen. But what made Diana different wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. She didn't visit hospitals for photo opportunities. She visited hospitals because she wanted to be there. And she would stay much longer than scheduled. And she came back when the cameras weren't watching. And she wrote letters, and she made phone calls, and she remembered names. And she would sit with the dying, and she held babies with HIV, and she embraced lepers.
Almost there. This is a very long waistband because I need to be able to tie in a bow in the back.
As a person who genuinely wanted to understand, saying, quote, nothing brings me more happiness than trying to help the most vulnerable people in society. It is a goal and an essential part of my life, a kind of destiny, unquote. And then she added something that revealed everything about who she was, saying, quote, whoever is in distress can call on me. I will come running wherever they are, unquote. And she meant it. And that was the thing about Diana. The compassion wasn't performed, it was real. And people could feel it in the sick, in the suffering, in the forgotten. They looked into her eyes and saw someone who actually cared. And Stephen Lee, director of the UK Institute of Charity Fundraising, managers said it plainly, saying, quote, her overall effect on charity is probably more significant than any other person's in the 20th century, unquote. Because she wasn't trained.
And that is the end of the waistband.
For international relations, she had failed her O-levels twice, in fact, but she had something else, and that is something no amount of education can provide. Quote, I'd like to be a queen in people's hearts, but I don't see myself being queen of this country, unquote. And she was right on both accounts. So on December 9th, 1992, when Prime Minister John Major rose in the House of Commons to deliver the statement to the Buckingham Palace that the Prince and Princess of Wales decided
I think it's going to have to be longer.
As you said before, the fairy tale was over.
Darn.
And it had been, by
I gotta cut out more.
the worst year in modern royal history. And the Queen herself called it an annus horribilis. And Andrew Morton's book had exposed the rot at the heart of the marriage. And Squidgygate and Camillagate had humiliated both parties, and a disastrous joint tour to South Korea, where Charles and Diana each other, had earned them the nickname the Globes. And the separation was inevitable, but it wasn't a divorce, not yet. Diana remained Princess of Wales, and she kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, and she was still technically part of the family, but she was no longer silent. So on November 20th, 1995, 23 million people in Britain tuned into BBC's Panorama, and another 200 million watched around the world. And Diana sat across from journalist Martin Bashir in Kensington Palace. And she was calm, she was composed, and utterly devastating. And for nearly an hour, she laid bare the truth of her marriage, the affairs, and the isolation, and the eating disorder, and the palace that had failed her. And she would speak of Charles' relationship with Camilla without bitterness, but without mercy either. And she admitted to her own affair with James Hewitt, like we spoke about before. And she described her bulimia and her self-harm, and her desperate cries for help that weren't answered. But this whole interview was a declaration of independence, and it was a direct challenge to the monarchy itself. And she went further. And when asked whether Charles was fit to be king, she hesitated just long enough. And she said, quote, there was always conflict on that subject with him because of the position I was seen to be in, unquote. And the message was unmistakable. Diana was no longer playing by palace rules, and the royal family was furious. And the Queen, after consulting with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury, took an unprecedented step. and she wrote to both Charles and Diana insisting that they divorce because Diana had forced their hand, and she had done it on her own terms. But in 2020, a BBC graphic designer named Matt Weissler came forward with a stunning revelation, as he had been asked to forge bank statements, fake documents suggesting that Diana's staff were being paid by the security services to spy on her. And Martin Bashir had used those forgeries to win Diana's trust, and he had fed her paranoia and manipulated her fears and convinced her brother Earl Spencer to make the introduction. So the entire interview, the one that changed everything, had been obtained through deception, and an independent investigation led by Lord Dyson confirmed it all. And Bashir was, quote, unreliable, devious, and dishonest, unquote. And the BBC had covered it up for years. And Prince William's response was devastating, saying, quote, it brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her, unquote. Because the interview, like I said before, had been Diana's declaration of independence, but it also had been a trap, one that deepened her mistrust of everyone around her and accelerated her spiral into isolation, and she would never know that truth. So the divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana received £17 million and $400,000 annually for her private office. And like I said before, she kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, and she retained access to the royal jets. And she would remain Princess of Wales, but she would lose something as well, because at Charles' insistence, she was stripped of the title Her Royal Highness. Basically, it was just petty cruelty on his part, just a final twist of the knife. And Diana would now have to curtsy to her own children. And when Prince William learned of it, he tried to confront her, saying, quote, I don't care what you're called, you're still mummy, unquote. And then he made her a promise, saying, quote, when I'm king, I'll give it back to you, unquote, which makes me want to cry. But after the divorce, Diana stepped back from public life, at least partially. And she resigned from over 100 charities, choosing to focus her energy on just 6 causes close to her heart. The Centrepoint, the English National Ballet, Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Leprosy Mission, and the National AIDS Trust, and the Royal Marston Hospital. So she was no longer trying to be everything to everyone. She was trying to figure out who she was, outside of the palace and outside of the title and outside of the spotlight. And for a while, there was a man, Dr. Hasnat Khan, a Pakistani heart surgeon, and they met at the Royal Brompton Hospital in 1995. And by all accounts, Diana was deeply in love with him.
And now I need to cut out her ascot.
She dreamed of life away from it all, with a
Let's see.
existence far from cameras and tabloids. But Khan couldn't handle the pressure and the scrutiny and the impossibility of a private life with the most famous woman in the world. And by the summer of 1997, it was over and Diana was alone again. So by the summer of 1997, Diana was 36 years old, and she was free, and she was searching. She was about to meet a man
Dropping
named
things.
Dadi Fayed, and his father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, was an Egyptian billionaire, owner of Harrods department store.
Got a bandana to get a reference size.
He cultivated a relationship with Diana for years, inviting her and the boys to his estate.
Again, ironing this fabric would help, but that's not where we're at right now. I'll just give it excess room so I can iron it flat and then clean it up later.
William and Harry, and they cruised the Mediterranean on the Jonacall, a 200-foot super yacht. And for a few days, they were just a mother and her sons, swimming and laughing under the summer sun. And Harry would later call it heaven. And then Dottie arrived. He was 42 and a film producer, and he was also handsome and attentive and charming in the way that men with unlimited resources can be charming. And he showered Diana with gifts, with attention, with the one thing she had always craved, just the whole sense that someone was actually choosing her. And by August 10th, photographers had captured them kissing on the yacht, and the photo went around the world, and the tabloids erupted. Because there was a new romance, a new scandal. So the questions came fast. Was it serious? Would she marry him? What would it mean for the boys? And Diana, for once, didn't seem to care what anyone thought. because she was happy, or something close to it at least.
Mhm.
But she had no way of knowing that she had less than 3 weeks to live. So the last 10 days of Diana's life were mostly spent on the water. And she and Dottie cruised the Mediterranean aboard the Junipal, drifting between Sardinia and the French coast.
I am gonna
And the
steam
crew
this. This is
described
driving me
her as
nuts.
relaxed, lighter than they'd ever seen her, and she listened to George Michael's older album on repeat. And she laughed easily, and she slept late, and for the first time in years, she seemed at peace. And on or around August 26th, they made a stop into Monaco, and Dottie took her to Reposi.
Actually, I can set up my iron. I can do that. That's fine. I need to iron it. It's driving me nuts.
And it was called Dis-moi oui, Tell Me Yes. And the ring Diana chose was worth approximately $200,000. It's a nice ring. And whether it was an engagement ring, a promise, or simply a gift, no one knows for certain, because Diana never got the chance to tell anyone. So Saturday, August 30th, 1997, in the late morning, Diana and Dottie left Sardinia aboard the Al Fayed family's private jet, a Harrods Gulfstream 1B, and their destination was Paris. And it was to be a brief stopover before returning back to London. And they landed at the Le Bourget airport at 3:20 in the afternoon. And the paparazzi were already waiting, of course, because they're assholes. And 4 motorcycles idled in the parking lot, cameras ready, engines running. And the hunt had begun before Diana even stepped off the plane. And from the airport, a chauffeured Mercedes took them into the city, and the first stop was the Villa Windsor, the former home of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the king who abdicated for the woman he loved. And Mohammed Al Fayed had recently leased it and was renovating it as a potential residence for Dottie and Diana. But they wouldn't stay for long, and Diana reportedly found
I'm tripping over cords and knocking out lights.
Afternoon, they arrived at the Ritz Paris, another Al Fayed property. And they
There we
entered
go.
through the rear, avoiding the growing crowds of photographers at the front. And once inside, Diana made a phone call, and she rang Balmoral to speak with William and Harry, but this would be the last time she would ever hear their voices. And that evening began to unravel almost immediately, as Dottie had planned a romantic dinner at Chez Bonnois, a quiet bistro in the first arrondissement. But when they arrived, a mob of paparazzi were already there, cameras pressed against the windows, flashbulbs popping and voices shouting. So they turned around without getting out of the car. So another attempt at privacy, but this time at the hotel's 2 Michelin star restaurant, Les Padons. Sorry if I'm saying these wrong, by the way. But word would spread, and within minutes, other diners were staring, and phones were ringing, and the sanctuary had been breached. So Diana and Dottie abandoned their meal and retreated upstairs to the Imperial Suite. And CCTV footage from that evening shows Diana walking through the lobby with her eyes downcast and her expression tired and distressed. And she just looks like a woman who just wanted to disappear. Meanwhile,
We are TurboTax experts in person. And let them do your taxes for you. Now this is taxes.
They set me up and schemed to ruin my life.
Just apologize for what you did. Just apologize.
a man named Henry Paul was making his way back to the hotel. And Paul was the 41-year-old deputy head of security at the Ritz, and he hadn't been scheduled to work that night. And his shift had ended hours earlier, but he was called back when it became clear that Diana and Dottie would need an escort. So he arrived at 10:08 p.m., and colleagues who saw him later said he seemed fine and sober and professional. But something had happened during the 3 hours he'd been off duty. Where Henry Paul went between 7 to 10 p.m. that night has never been fully explained. And investigators would later find evidence that he consumed at least 2 Rickards, a strong anise-flavored aperitif at the hotel bar. But even that didn't account for what they would find in his blood later on. And he was also allegedly taking a dangerous cocktail of medications at the time. Prozac for depression, and Thiapride, a drug used to treat alcoholism, and a sleeping pill called Noctamid. And all 3 carried warnings against driving, and all 3 had their effects magnified by alcohol. So Henry Paul should not have been behind the wheel of a car that night. But no one knew, or if they did, no one stopped him. So just after midnight, a plan was hatched. Dottie was fed up, and the paparazzi had made the evening completely impossible, and he wanted to get Diana back to his apartment near the Arc de Triomphe without being followed. So they devised a decoy, and Dottie's regular Mercedes and his usual driver would pull up to the front entrance of the Ritz, creating a diversion. The photographer would follow. Meanwhile, a second car, a rented black Mercedes S280, would slip out the back with Diana and Dottie inside, and Henry Paul would drive. And Trevor Reese-Jones, Dottie's bodyguard, would ride in the front passenger seat. And no backup vehicle, no police escort, no other security, just the four of them. So at 12:20 a.m., they made their move. Henry Paul led them through the rear exit onto Rue Long. And as they climbed into the Mercedes, he reportedly turned to the photographers gathered nearby and called out, "Don't try to follow, you'll never catch us." Then he floored it, which is extremely odd. Given they had already created this diversion, why would he draw attention? It doesn't make sense. And the route Henry Paul chose was unconventional, because instead of taking the well-lit Champs-Élysées, the direct path to Dottie's apartment, he veered toward the Seine embankment. A faster route, yes, but also darker and more isolated, and it required passing through a tunnel, the Pont de l'Allemand underpass, which was 660 feet long, 2 lanes, and had a gentle curve, and a row of unforgiving concrete pillars down the center. And behind them, at least 6 paparazzi vehicles gave chase, motorcycles and cars weaving through traffic, desperate to get the shot. And at the Place de la Concorde, the Mercedes ran a red light, and witnesses described the car as already unstable, fishtailing, accelerating wildly, and the driver seemingly not in control at all. And the speed limit in the tunnel was 30 miles per hour, and Henry Paul was doing at least 65, and some estimates put it even higher. And the clock read 12:23 a.m. at this point. And apparently, no one inside the car was wearing a seatbelt. So the Mercedes entered the Pont de la Mall tunnel at twice the legal speed. And inside,
Alright, there's her ascot.
and Henry Paul gripped the wheel, weaving through the dim orange light. And Trevor Reese-Jones sat
Make
rigid
sure
in the
these
passenger
stay
seat.
together.
And in the back, Diana and Dottie, finally alone, finally escaping. And behind them, the paparazzi were falling back. So the decoy seemingly had worked, and the Ritz was receding in the rearview mirror. And for a moment, it must have felt like freedom. And then Henry Paul saw the car, a white Fiat Uno, puttering along in the right lane at maybe 30 miles an hour, and a dog in the back seat, and a driver who had no idea what was barreling toward him. And then Paul swerved to avoid it, and the Mercedes flipped the Fiat's rear bumper, a glancing blow just enough to destabilize the car. And paint scraped against paint, and the Fiat wobbled and kept going, but the Mercedes did not. And Paul overcorrected, and the car lurched left, and the rear tires lost grip. And allegedly, 62 feet of rubber scorched into the concrete as the Mercedes began to slide. And he tried to correct again, but it was too late, and they were going way too fast. And the second skid mark, allegedly around 105 feet, carved a diagonal line across the tunnel floor, straight toward the 13th pillar. And the impact was catastrophic. And the Mercedes struck the pillar head-on at somewhere between 60 and 70 miles per hour. And the front of the car crumpled instantly,
Sewing
folding
machine
inward
time.
like aluminum foil. And the force was so violent that it left a perfect imprint, a cookie-cutter outline of the vehicle stamped into the concrete. And the car didn't stop. And it would spin counterclockwise, a half rotation, then slammed backward into the tunnel wall with a second sickening crash. And when it finally came to rest, the Mercedes was facing the wrong direction, east instead of west, and smoke rose from the wreckage, and glass glittered across the roadway, and then there was silence. And Henry Paul died on impact.
Give you a closer look at that while I get my machine up here.
His aorta ruptured, and he was gone before he could register what had happened. And the steering wheel had crushed his chest. And at the time, he was 41 years old.
Oh, that was an interesting interruption. This machine's 50 pounds, that's why we're struggling. Okay.
force of the collision threw him forward into the back of the front seats, and he would sustain massive internal injuries. And he would be 42 years old at the time of his death. But Trevor Reese-Jones somehow survived because the airbags saved him just barely. But essentially, every bone in his face was shattered and his jaw was dislocated, and his tongue had been forced back into his throat, and he would require 10 hours of reconstructive surgery and over 150 pieces of titanium to rebuild his skull. And he has no memory at all of the crash, apparently. And he's told he never would. And then there is Diana. She had been sitting behind Henry Paul, and when the car struck the pillar, she was thrown forward hard, and her chest slammed into the back of the front seat, and she slid down onto the floor of the Mercedes, wedged between the seats, with her legs crumpled beneath her. And when first responders got there, she was still alive. But inside her chest, something had torn, and the impact had done catastrophic damage. And her heart had been displaced, knocked to the right side of her chest, and her left pulmonary vein, the vessel that carries blood from the lungs to her heart, had been ripped at the point where it connected to the atrium. So she was bleeding internally and massively. So with every beat of her heart, blood would pour into her chest cavity instead of circulating through her body. And it would be a very rare injury, but almost always fatal, but not immediately. So Diana was barely but still conscious, slumped on the floor of the ruined Mercedes, just gasping for air. So Dr. Frederick Melies was driving home from a party, and he was an off-duty emergency physician just passing through.
I gotta find a screwdriver. I gotta change out my needle because it broke last time.
And ran toward the smoking car, and he had no idea who was inside. But what he found was absolute carnage. It was 4 people, 2 of them clearly dead, and a man in the front seat with catastrophic facial injuries, somehow still breathing, and in the back, a woman. And she was on her knees on the floor of the car, barely conscious, but still breathing. And Melies reached in, trying to stabilize her airway, and he spoke to her softly, trying to keep her calm. Her murmured words, the last coherent words anyone would ever hear her say, was, "Oh my God, what's happened?" And Melies didn't recognize her, because her face was obscured by hair and blood, and he thought she was perhaps a model, because she was so tall and so striking, even in this state. And it wasn't until the ambulance arrived that someone told him, "That's Princess Diana." So the emergency call came at 12:26 a.m. and 3 minutes after the impact, and police would arrive at 12:30. And the first ambulance, a SAMU unit, France's Mobile Emergency Service,
I might need to get a dime instead. That's not turning it.
American or British paramedics,
Need better leverage.
emergency teams include a physician. Their protocol is different. It's to stabilize on the scene before transport. Treat first, move second. And it would take an hour before Diana left the tunnel. So at approximately 1 a.m., emergency workers finally extracted her from the wreckage. And as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her heart stopped, and she would go into cardiac arrest. And the medical team shocked her and performed CPR and pumped her chest in the back of an ambulance parked in the middle of the Paris tunnel, and her heart would start again. And at 1:18 a.m., she was loaded into the ambulance, and at 1:41 a.m., more than an hour after the crash, the ambulance finally began moving toward Petit Salpêtrière Hospital. It was only 4 miles away, but the journey took 25 minutes. And that was because they had to stop to treat Diana. The ambulance moved slowly and sometimes stopping entirely so the doctor inside could continue working. And the thinking was that a patient in Diana's condition couldn't survive a high-speed transport, and it was better to stabilize and better to keep the heart beating. So whether a faster transport could have saved her remains one of the most debated questions of the entire tragedy. And some doctors believe she might have survived if she'd reached the operating table sooner, the so-called golden hour of trauma care. But others say the injury was simply too severe, that a torn pulmonary vein combined with a displaced heart.
I'll deal with this machine later. We'll work on the other machine over here. You can't see that. I'll get you on that one soon.
Arrived at the hospital at 2:06 a.m., 1 hour and 43 minutes after the crash. Diana was rushed into surgery, and Dr. Alan Pavie, one of France's foremost cardiac surgeons, led the team. And they opened her chest, and they found the tear in the pulmonary vein, and they sutured it. But the damage was too great, and she had lost too much blood, and her heart had been struggling for too long. And the team would try everything: external cardiac massage, internal cardiac massage, hands physically squeezing her heart, electric shocks, adrenaline injected directly into the cardiac muscle, and for 2 hours they
All right,
fought
let's
to
scoot
bring
you
her
over
back.
to the
At
other
4 a.m.,
machine.
they stopped, and Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead, and she was 36 years old. So protect your dreams under our roof. American Family Insurance.
Get Chris over here.
Chris spills every month without breaking the bank. I know what you're thinking. It must be too quick. At Balmoral Castle, the phone rang in the darkness, and Prince Charles was woken by the Queen's deputy private secretary, and he was told the news. And he sat in silence for a long moment. And then he walked down the hall to wake his sons. And William was 15, and Harry was 12. And Harry would later write about the moment in his memoir, how he lay in bed waiting, and how his father sat on the edge of the mattress, and how he expected or needed to hear that Mummy was hurt, but she was going to be okay, saying, quote, "I remember waiting patiently for Pa to confirm that indeed Mummy was all right, and I remember him not doing that," quote. And Charles told them their mother was dead, and he didn't hug them. He didn't know how, and then he left the room. And Harry didn't cry, not at that moment, and he wouldn't cry for years, allegedly, because he was only 12 years old. He didn't realize the impact of the entire situation. How would any 12-year-old? But soon he would find that nothing would ever be the same. But before Diana even had her funeral, the questions began. And those were, how did this happen, and who was responsible? And the question that would haunt the next decade was this really an accident? And 3 separate investigations would attempt to answer those questions: French, British, and official, each one more exhaustive than the last. And together, they would interview over 1,000 witnesses, examine tens of thousands of documents, and spend tens of millions of dollars, and still, for some, the answers would never be enough. So the crash itself, as we know, happened on French soil, with French jurisdiction and French investigation. And Judge Hervé Stéphan was assigned to lead the inquiry, and it would consume nearly 2 years of his life, and 18 months of forensic analysis, witness interviews, and painstaking reconstruction of the final minutes of Diana's life. And his team interviewed over 1,000 witnesses, and they examined the wreckage of the Mercedes down to the molecular level. And they analyzed every frame of CCTV footage from the Ritz, and they traced Henry Paul's movements, his finances, his medical history, and what they found was damning, because the toxicology report was unambiguous, and Henry Paul's blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was between 175 and 187 milligrams per 100 millimeters of blood, and the legal limit in France was 50. So he was nearly 4 times over the limit, the equivalent of roughly 10 drinks. But it wasn't just alcohol. His blood also contained traces of fluoxetine, the active ingredient in Prozac, and tyroside, a drug prescribed specifically to treat chronic alcoholism, the drug that we talked about before that he was taking, and trace amounts of sleeping medication. And all 3 drugs carried explicit warnings against chemicals, and all 3 were effects dramatically amplified. So Henry Paul wasn't just drunk, he was impaired on multiple levels, and with his reflexes dulled and his judgment compromised, his ability to control a vehicle at high speed fundamentally degraded. So the question that haunted investigators was, how did no one notice? And colleagues and witnesses professional. And the CCTV footage showed him calmly chatting with staff, walking slowly, not stumbling and not slurring, but the blood doesn't lie. Either Henry Paul had developed such a tolerance to alcohol that he could mask severe intoxication, a hallmark of chronic alcoholism, or something else was going on. And his family would later challenge the results, and they demanded independent testing, and they suggested the blood samples had been contaminated or switched. Investigators also examined the role of epilepsy, because at least 7 vehicles had pursued the Mercedes through the streets of Paris, photographers on motorcycles and cars just desperate for the photograph that would make their careers. And some had followed at dangerously close range, and others had used blocking techniques, pulling alongside or in front of the Mercedes to slow it down for better shots. And 9 photographers were initially charged with manslaughter and failure to render assistance. But as the investigation progressed, prosecutors progressed. So the analysis of the crash site showed that as they entered the Pont de la Mall tunnel, the pursuing vehicles were some distance behind, so they had caused the crash directly. And the intoxication had done that. But the paparazzi were part of the story, though, because they had contributed to the atmosphere of the pursuit and the desperation to escape. But they hadn't physically forced the Mercedes into the pillar necessarily. But they also didn't help at all when they did crash, because they did catch up and there was no assistance. In fact, a lot of them just took photos while there were people dying in the car. Just absolute scum of the earth. So in September of 1999, all manslaughter charges were dropped, unfortunately. But 3 photographers were later convicted of lesser charges, which was invasion of privacy for photographing the dying victims at the crash scene, and their punishment was a fine of €1 symbolic each.
Our on-site service consists of a mobile shredder truck that will come to right on site on the property from the second we come in to take custody of the documents and material.
I have no words for that. That makes me furious. So Judge Stefan's final report ran hundreds of pages, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The crash was an accident caused by a driver who was intoxicated, over-medicated, and traveling at a reckless speed on a difficult stretch of road while attempting to evade a slower vehicle. And Henry Paul was solely responsible. Case closed. But for many, the case was just beginning. So for 7 years after Duncan's death, conspiracy theories festered, and the loudest voice belonged to Mohammed Al-Fayed, because the Harrods owner had lost his eldest son in which was incandescent, and he refused to accept that Dottie's death and Diana's was simply a tragic accident, and he believed they had been murdered. And Al-Fayed's theory was elaborate, inflammatory, and consistent. And British intelligence services acting on orders from highest levels of the establishment, specifically Prince Philip, had assassinated Diana and Dottie to prevent their relationship from progressing. This is the theory, by the way. I'm not saying why would Prince Philip do this? Because this is Muhammad's theory. Diana was pregnant with Dottie's child. This is Muhammad's theory. And because they were planning to announce their engagement, and because the British establishment could not tolerate the idea that the mother of the future king was a Muslim, sibling for William and Harry, and might spend her life with an Egyptian family that the royals considered beneath them. And Al-Fayed did not whisper these accusations. He shouted them to the press, to Parliament, to anyone who would listen. And he spent millions funding private investigations, issued documentaries, and he hired lawyers across multiple continents, and eventually the pressure became impossible to ignore. So in January of 2004, Sir John Stevens, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, put his most senior law enforcement officer, was asked to investigate. And the inquiry was codenamed Operation Paget. And it started as Stevens assembled a team of 14 officers. And over nearly 3 years, they investigated 175 separate conspiracy theories and over 300 witnesses, including, remarkably, Prince Charles and Prince William. And they obtained what Stevens described as unprecedented access to the files of MI5 and MI6, which is Britain's domestic and intelligence services. So they dug deep, and they examined Diana's medical records and her financial records and her phone records. And they analyzed his bank accounts, his contacts, and his possible intelligence connections. And they reviewed every frame of CCTV footage, every autopsy photograph, and every fragment of forensic evidence. The investigation cost £8 million, and the final report ran 832 pages, supported by over 11,000 pages of additional documentation. So Operation Paget systematically demolished the conspiracy theories. And on MI6 involvement, investigators obtained access to intelligence service files, and they found no evidence of any operation targeting Diana, Dottie, or Henry Paul. And there was no surveillance and no assassination planning. Nothing. And anonymous MI6 officers testified that the agency had maintained no file on Diana or Dottie, and they had no operational interest in it. And the suggestion that they would murder a member of the royal family, even an ex-member, was inconceivable. And on Prince Philip's alleged involvement, Al Fayed had accused Prince Philip personally of ordering the assassination, which is a fascinating accusation. And Stevens found not a shred of evidence to support this claim. Diana's relationship with the royal family was complicated, yes, but she remained the mother of the future king, and murdering her would have been destroying the honor rather than
Whoa.
protecting it.
Things
And
are jumping.
Paul,
Hang
as
on.
an intelligence agent, this theory had some traction because of the unexplained money, because Henry Paul's bank accounts contained approximately 1.2 million francs, roughly $200,000, salary of only about $35,000 a year. So where had that all come from? Well, investigators traced the deposits meticulously, and they found that Paul had received payments from various sources over the years, including possibly modest sums for providing information to French intelligence services. But there was no evidence he worked for MI6, and no evidence he was a double agent, and no evidence of any connection to British intelligence whatsoever. So Stevens concluded that Paul was likely a low-level informant for French security services, someone who might tip them off about VIP movements at the Ritz. And I mean, we can go back to him yelling out of the car that you can't catch us and stuff. So it seems like he was just a piece of shit, basically. And crucially, Henry Paul wasn't even supposed to work that night, and he had gone off duty hours earlier and was called back unexpectedly. So if this was an assassination, the assassins had somehow known to involve a man who wasn't scheduled to be there. And on the pregnancy claim, this was central to Al Fayed's theory that Diana was carrying Dottie's child, and that this pregnancy was the motive for murder. But the forensic evidence was definitive, and that was that Diana was not pregnant. Dr. Robert Chapman, who conducted the post-mortem examination, found no sign of pregnancy in her womb or ovaries. And forensic scientist Angela Gallup tested blood samples from the crash scene and found no trace of HCG hormone that indicates pregnancy. Diana's close friends confirmed it, and Rosa Malton, before her death, stated Diana had her period during their trip together, and Lady Annabelle Goldsmith saying, quote, "I need marriage like a rash on my face," unquote. So
Switch to TurboTax. All 100% free. Now this is tax.
Oh, it completely missed it on that side. Lovely. Ugh, my allergies are killing me. I can't even see straight.
Intuit TurboTax.
aged. So the foundation of Al Fayed's conspiracy theory was factually false. And I can safely assume it was just driven by pure grief and rage. So we'll move on to the bright flash theory. And some witnesses claim to have seen a blinding white flash inside the tunnel just before the crash, supposedly a strobe device used by intelligence operatives to disorient Henry Paul. And Richard Tomlinson, a former MI6 officer, had initially suggested this was a technique used by intelligence services. But at the 2008 inquest, he backtracked dramatically, admitting he could not remember specifically any details about strobe lights. And more importantly, the primary witness who reported the flash, Francois Levistre, was contradicted by his own wife, who was sitting in the passenger seat of his car. And 4 other witnesses near the tunnel entrance reported seeing no flash either. And the forensic reconstruction showed that the sequence of events leading to the crash, Henry Paul clipping the Fiat, losing control, skidding into the pillar, began well before the location where any flash was supposedly even seen. so the physics just didn't work, and the flash theory was impossible. And that brings us to the Fiat Uno. So this remained the one genuine mystery, because the paint transfer evidence proved the Mercedes had made contact with a white Fiat Uno, and witnesses described seeing such a vehicle exit the tunnel directly with a shattered taillight. But despite examining over 40,000 white Fiat Unos registered in the Paris area, investigators never definitively identified the car or its driver, which is crazy. I mean, I the country, I guess. That is very odd to me. But one suspect out of all of this emerged, James Edmondson, who owned a white Fiat Uno and had allegedly boasted of intelligence connections. But Adamson provided documentary evidence proving he was at his home, which was 177 miles from Paris, and he was in bed with her. And in May of 2000, Anderson was found dead in a burnt-out BMW, ruled a, he did it himself. A conspiracy theorist seized
He
on
did
this
it
as
himself.
evidence of silence. Yeah, it seems like people, to themselves, and they're involved in getting these things. It's a little
Suspicious,
but
yeah.
investigators would find no connection to but Stevens concluded this person was not the cause of an unlucky motorist who happened to be alive. He was clipped by a speeding Mercedes and fled the scene out of fear, which seems to be so on December 14th, 2006, Sir John Stevens held a press conference, and his words were unequivocal, saying, quote, "There was no conspiracy to murder the occupants of the car. This was a tragic accident. The conclusion is that on the evidence available now, there was no conspiracy to murder any of the occupants of the car. Henry Paul, the driver of the Mercedes, was the cause of the crash." And he addressed Al-Fayed directly, saying, "I know that Mr. Al-Fayed has very strongly held personal opinions on this matter. I can only present the facts, the evidence, and my conclusions," unquote. And Operation Paget was the most comprehensive investigation into a single incident in British history, and it changed the report completely, and he called it whitewash. And he demanded a public inquest for jury, ordinary citizens who could hear the evidence and render their own verdict. And he got his wish. So an inquest is a peculiarly British institution. The trial, it doesn't determine guilt or innocence. Its purpose is murder. It's just the person who died, and where, and when, and how. And to answer the question of what inquests into the deaths of
Whoop.
Diana.
Sorry, bump the camera.
Began in
Not used to
October
it hanging
2007,
over me.
more than 10 years after the crash, and Lord Justice Scott Baker presided, and the proceedings would last 6 months, and over 250 witnesses would testify, and the jury, 11 ordinary British citizens, would travel to Paris to walk through the Pont de l'Allemand tunnel themselves. And it would be the longest and most expensive inquest in British history, and Mohammed Al-Fayed would finally have his day in court. So for months, the inquest methodically reviewed everything. The forensics, the toxicology, the CCTV footage, the eyewitness accounts, the medical records, the phone records, the financial records, and witnesses who had been interviewed by French investigators and by Operation Paget returned to testify again. And their accounts were tested, challenged, and compared against the documentary evidence. And Trevor Rees-Jones, the sole survivor, took the stand. And he, as we said before, had no memory of the crash itself, because the head trauma had erased everything from the moment they left the Ritz until he woke up in the hospital.
I need black thread now.
At one point, he believed it was an accident, and there was no conspiracy and no assassination, just a drunk driver going too
Black
fast. And the medical experts confirmed again that Diana was not pregnant, and the postmortem was thorough, and the science was unambiguous, and there was no baby. And emergency responders detailed the agonizing timeline, the hour Diana spent at the crash scene, the slow ambulance journey, the frantic efforts to save her, and could she have survived with faster treatment? And the doctors debated this very, very intensely, and some believed the scoop and run approach used in Britain or America might have given her a chance, but others said the injury was simply too catastrophic. and that a torn pulmonary vein with a displaced heart was unsurvivable regardless of how quickly she reached the operating table. So there was no real consensus on that, and there never would be. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, and that was Mohammed Al-Fayed taking the stand in February of 2008. Because for years he had made his accusations through press releases and documentaries, but now he would make them under oath and subject to cross-examination in a court of law. And he did not disappoint. As Al-Fayed called Prince Philip a Nazi and a racist, and he called the royal family the Dracula family, and he accused MI6 of orchestrating the murders, and he accused the British establishment of covering up the truth. And when pressed for evidence, he invoked Diana herself, and saying she had feared for her life, he said, and she had
Woo!
written
I got
letters
some fuzzies out of there.
predicting her own death, and she had known they were coming for her, saying, quote unquote, she knew, Diana knew. But under cross-examination, the foundations of his claims crumbled, and his own lawyers were forced to make a stunning admission, saying, quote, there is no direct evidence of royal or MI6 involvement in the deaths, unquote. They were asking the jury to infer a conspiracy from circumstantial evidence and alleged motives. And the direct evidence, the forensics, the toxicology, the eyewitness accounts, the phone records, the intelligence files, all pointed in one direction, and that was an accident. And Al-Fayed left the stand unbowed and unrepentant and unconvinced. And he would never accept the truth. And not because the truth was hidden, but because the truth was unbearable. Because his son was dead, and Diana was dead, and there was no one to blame but a drunk driver and a terrible sequence of random events. And some losses are too great to attribute to chance. So on April 7th of 2008, the jury retired to consider their verdict. And they had 11 options, ranging from unlawful killing to accidental death to the open verdict favored by those who believed the truth could never be known. And they deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the foreman delivered a verdict that was both definitive and nuanced. And by a vote of 9-2, the jury found that Diana and Dottie had been unlawfully killed, but not murdered and not assassinated. Unlawfully killed through the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles: the paparazzi, and the grossly negligent driving of the Mercedes driver, Henry Paul. So it was a split verdict, assigning blame to both the pursuers and the pursued. And contributing factors, the jury added, was Henry Paul's intoxication, the failure of any occupant to wear a seatbelt, the collision with the concrete pillar rather than the tunnel wall, and what the verdict was not was evidence to any.
Today's video is sponsored by Heartopia, a cozy life simulation game designed with
This one
creativity
keeps
and freedom in
interrupting
mind.
at weird
In this
times.
game,
Conspiracy. So Lord Justice Scott Baker, summarizing the proceedings, was blunt, saying, quote, there was no evidence that Diana was pregnant. There was no evidence that there was an engagement ring. There was no evidence of any conspiracy. Not a shred of evidence, unquote. And Prince William and Harry released a joint statement saying, quote, we agree with their verdicts and are both hugely grateful to each and every one of them, unquote. Enforcement and a desire for closure. And Mohammed Al-Fayed announced he would accept the verdict for the sake of Diana and Diana's unquote. But he never truly let it go. And in interviews over the following years, he would return again and again to his accusations. The Dracula conspiracy. He died in August of 2022, murdered. But through all the investigations of thousands of witnesses and hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation, everybody came to the same conclusion, and that is that Diana, Princess of Wales, died because a drunk driver lost control of a speeding car in a Paris tunnel. No conspiracy, no assassination, no dark forces. Truth. Sometimes it isn't enough. She had written it down in October of 1995. She told her lawyer, Victor Mishkon, that, quote, reliable sources, unquote, had warned her of efforts to cause, quote, an accident in her car with prepared brake failure. In October 1996, she wrote to her called Girl, saying, quote, my husband is planning an accident in my car. In order clear for him to marry. She needed Charles, not Philip. She needed her ex-husband, not the intelligence services. And she was wrong about who and how, and there was no brake failure and no planned assassination. But she was right about this. She did die in a car crash, and the most hunted woman in the world had predicted her own ending. And the coincidence, that terrible, inexplicable, haunting coincidence, was that's why I still don't fully believe it. I mean, it all makes sense. Something feels off. And polls taken years after Diana's death consistently showed a significant percentage of the people, sometimes more, believed she had been murdered. And maybe it's part of the grief when someone that famous and that beloved, that alive, just dies so suddenly, and the mind rebels against randomness. There must be a reason. There's definitely something in my mind that just says there has to be a reason. There must be a villain. There must be something more than a drunk driver and an unlucky sequence of events. And part of it is just Diana herself. She had told people that she feared for her life, and she had written it down, and then she died exactly what she predicted in a car crash. Part of it is just all the sheer weight of the questions. As explained well for the hours spent hour gap that no one could explain these questions, but addressing a question isn't the same as answering it. And in the gaps between evidence and explanation, conspiracy theories take root.
Princess Wales, who was reported to be injured in that accident you've just seen pictured of, has actually died in Paris's Salpêtrière hospital.
And the news traveled faster than anyone could process it. And by dawn on August 31st, 1997, the world knew. And radio stations interrupted their programming, and television networks scraped their schedules, and newspapers tore up their front pages and started over. Because Diana was dead. And the reaction was immediate and visceral and completely unprecedented.
Protect your dream home. Under our roof. American Family Insurance.
See yourself in a new light at Palm Beach Tan. With state-of-the-art sunbed and spray tanning. For a limited time, try any service free.
And in London, people woke to the news and didn't know what to do with themselves. So they went to Kensington Palace, and at first it was dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and they came carrying flowers, single roses, elaborate bouquets, whatever they could find at petrol stations and corner shops on a Sunday morning. And they laid them at the gates, and they wrote cards, and they wept. And by the end of the first day, the flowers were knee-deep. And by the end of the week, they stretched 30 feet from the palace walls, an ocean of cellophane and petals, and around 60 million flowers in total, with 10,000 tons of bouquets. And the scent was so overwhelming, it was sickly sweet and almost suffocating, people would report. But people didn't just leave flowers. They left teddy bears and photographs and handwritten poems and children's drawings and candles that flickered through the night. And one woman even left her wedding dress. But strangers stood together and sobbed, and they hugged people they never met. And they waited in lines for hours just to sign condolence notes. And eventually it was 43 of them, 43 millions of signatures. This has never happened in Britain before, and nothing like this has happened anywhere else. To this day, Prime Minister Tony Blair understood the moment. He had been in office for only 4 months. He was young, media savvy, and attuned to the public mood in ways the royal family had never been. And that Sunday morning, he stood outside a church in his constituency and delivered a statement that would define the tragedy. And his voice cracked as he spoke.
I feel like everyone else in this country today, utterly devastated. Our thoughts and prayers are with Princess Diana's family, in particular her 2 sons, the 2 boys. Our hearts go out to them.
And then he said the words that would follow her forever.
She was the people's princess, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories. forever.
The people's princess. It was perfect. It was very true, and it threw into sharp relief the silence from the actual royal family. Because the royals weren't in London. They were at Balmoral, their Scottish estate, 500 miles away, and they weren't coming back because the Queen had made a decision. William and Harry needed to be protected. They needed privacy to grieve, and they would remain in Scotland, shielded from media frenzy, surrounded by family. And it was, by royal standards, the correct choice. A tradition and a protocol. The institution was protecting its own, but it was a catastrophic misreading of the moment. And the public didn't see a grieving grandmother protecting her grandsons. They saw a cold family hiding in a castle while their people wept in the streets. And then there was the flag. Because above Buckingham Palace, the flagpole stood bare. And this was tradition. The royal standard only flies when the monarch is in residence. And it never flies at half-mast because the monarchy never dies. And one sovereign succeeds another, and the institution continues. But the public didn't care about tradition. They saw an empty flagpole above the palace, while the nation drowned in grief, and they were furious. "Quote unquote, where is our queen?" demanded the Sun. And "quote unquote, where is her flag? Show us your care," pleaded the Express. And for 5 days, the Queen said nothing, and the silence was deafening. And inside Balmoral, the family was fracturing, and Charles was devastated. Whatever their differences, Diana was the mother of his children, and now his sons were motherless, and he wanted to fly to Paris immediately to bring her body home. But the Queen initially resisted, because Diana was no longer royal, because she was no longer her royal niece. A royal aircraft seemed inappropriate, but Charles reportedly exploded, and he would bring her home, and he would do it on a royal plane, whether the palace approved or not. He got it his way. But meanwhile, William and Harry existed in a kind of suspended animation, and they went to church that Sunday morning, which was tradition, and they walked to the Scottish moors, which was a tradition, and the adults around them seemed to believe that maintaining routine would somehow help. Which, what?
What?
Described those days as surreal, with the adults speaking in hushed tones and the force to normalcy and the sense that something enormous had happened, but no one quite knew how to acknowledge it. And he didn't cry. He kept waiting for the tears to come, but they didn't. And he began to wonder if something was wrong with him. And by Thursday, the pressure had become unbearable, and the Queen could no longer ignore the public rage. And Tony Blair's government was quietly warning that the monarchy itself was at risk, and that decades of goodwill were evaporating by the hour. And on September 4th, something unprecedented happened. The Union Jack was raised above Buckingham Palace and lowered to half staff. And it was the first time in history the Queen had bent tradition, and the institution had bowed to the people. And that evening, Queen Elizabeth II finally spoke, and she addressed the nation in a live broadcast from Buckingham Palace, sitting before a window that looked out onto the crowds still gathered at the gates, still laying flowers, still weeping for a woman that the palace had never fully.
All the freaking ads.
Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope.
She spoke carefully, as she always did, and deliberately, without visible emotion, but with something that sounded almost like contrition.
I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys.
And then a phrase that seemed designed to answer her critics.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death.
It wasn't an apology. The Queen didn't apologize, but it was at least an acknowledgement. The closest the monarchy would ever come to admitting it had done something wrong. And the next day, the royal family September 6th, the state at St. James Palace. Morning, it was placed on a horse-drawn gun carriage for the procession to Westminster Abbey, and the route stretched nearly 3.5 miles from Kensington Palace through Hyde Park, past Buckingham Palace, down the Mall to the Abbey. And it was hours. And the crowds by the time the procession lined the streets, and they stood 10, 15 minutes deep, and they perched on lampposts and climbed statues and pressed against barricades and Diana, and they threw flowers at the coffin as it passed. That was what everyone and you could hear the horses' hooves on the pavement, and you could hear the creak of the wheels. No cheering, no chanting, just a sound of a sleep's breath. Others stood frozen. And behind the coffin, walking in the September sun, were 5 men: Prince Philip, Charles, Earl Spencer, and 2 boys. William, who was 15, and Harry, who was 12. Controversial from the start. Called it a barbarity, forcing 2 grieving children to perform their grief for the world's cameras. Diana would have never wanted it, he said. The public expected it, and William was reluctant, and Harry was terrified. To march surrounded by millions of on earth pointed at their faces, and it was Prince Philip who finally settled it. To his grandsons. So they walked. And 15-year-old William, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the crowds, and 12-year-old Harry, smaller, slighter, his face a mask of confusion and grief. And years later, Harry would say, quote, "I don't think any child should be asked to do that under any circumstances," unquote. But he did it, and they both did, because it's what Windsors do. They don't let anyone see them break. And on top of the coffin lay a wreath of white roses. And on it, the word, mummy. Westminster Abbey held 2,000 heads of state and celebrity workers, the anonymous, seated side by side, and Queen Noor of Jordan, Hillary Clinton, Tom Hanks, Spielberg, Luciano Pavarotti, 5 billion people was watching the service. And it remains one of the most viewed broadcasts in human history, and in Britain alone, 32.1 million people tuned in, and streets were emptied and offices closed, and the country simply stopped. And 2 moments from that service would become etched into memory forever. And the first was a song. Elton John had been Diana's friend for years, and they had a falling out shortly before her death, and one of those petty celebrity feuds, and they'd only just reconciled. And now he sat at the grand piano in Westminster Abbey preparing to sing a song he'd written 2 decades earlier about another icon who died too young. Candle in the Wind was originally about Marilyn Monroe. And in the days after Diana's death, Elton John and his lyricist Bernie Taupin rewrote the words, "Goodbye, England's Rose," he sang. "May you ever grow in our hearts." And he used a teleprompter because he was terrified he would slip back into the original lyrics, and that he'd say Norma Jean instead of England's Rose and desecrate the moment. But he didn't. And when he finished, the Abbey was silent, and then came the applause. Soft at first, then swelling, rolling through the pews like a wave. And Elton John has never performed that version of the song since, and he said he never will, not unless William and Harry personally ask him. And the recording became one of the best-selling singles of all time. It was 33 million copies, and all proceeds went to Diana's charities. And the second moment was the eulogy. Earl Spencer, Diana's younger brother, walked to the lectern, and he was handsome, composed, and furious. And what he delivered was not simply a tribute to his sister, it was an indictment. And he spoke of Diana's compassion, her humor, her gift for connection, and he spoke of her as a sister and not a symbol. But then his voice hardened, and he said,
"It is a point to remember that of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age."
But he wasn't finished, and he spoke of her vulnerability and deep feelings of unworthiness, a clear shot at the institution that had failed her. And he questioned whether the press had blood on their hands, and then he made a promise that landed like a grenade.
"I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned."
Your blood family. All my praise goes to Earl Spencer, I tell you what. But he was talking about the Spencers, the people Diana had come from, not the people she'd married into. It was a declaration of war delivered from a pulpit to a global audience of billions. And when Spencer finished, there was silence. And then, from outside the Abbey, a sound like rain. But it wasn't rain, it was applause, rolling through the crowds on the streets, sweeping down the aisles and building until it filled the ancient church. They clapped for their uncle. And the senior royals, sat frozen. They did not applaud, and the cameras caught it all. Discover our gorgeous bridesmaid. In that afternoon, Diana was taken home, not to London, not to a royal vault, but to all where her family had lived. She was buried on a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake. Protected by the public, safe from what Earl Spencer called they placed two items in Diana's hands, a photograph of William and Harry, and the letter Harry had written, the one addressed to Mummy. And we don't know what it said, and I hope we never will. Diana's been gone for almost 30 years, and somehow she's never left. Both sides have been sure of that, and in 2017, on the 20th anniversary of her death, William and Harry commissioned a statue for the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, the place where Diana had found peace, where she walked among the flowers, where mourners laid millions of bouquets in the days after she died. And on July 1st, 2021, what would have been her 60th birthday, they unveiled it together, and the brothers stood side by side, their relationship fracturing, but united by the woman who had shaped them both, saying, quote, "Every day, Princess Charlotte and Elizabeth Diana and Lilibet Diana, and the grandmother they'll never meet, written into their identities forever." Princess, and that is how she lived, and that is how she will remain. But that is that for Princess Diana. More of almost a biography, conspiracy. I'd like to know what you guys think about it. If you have any fond memories of Princess Diana, even if you're not old enough to remember her necessarily, like me. I was one when she passed away. But I mean, looking back, she was truly an icon, and she's missed by people who didn't even live in the same lifetime as her, including myself. But let me know what other cases you want me to look into. I always read the comments, and I will see you.
Alrighty, I am gonna call that for YouTube. I'm gonna go hop over to TT because I'm not allowed to say the name on YouTube. I'm gonna stream on the other platform. You can hang out with me over there if you want to continue streaming with me. I'll be back in a little bit.